first slide. So we're here to talk about water. The reason we need to do that is because the main water that comes through our tap very often comes from short streams, which is why we're here talking about them. That's a fantastic habitat that we need to preserve. Thinking about how much water that we need in the UK, then back in 2016, the National Infrastructure Commission did a complete survey of the water industry and came up with the rough estimate that we needed an extra 3,435 million litres a day. That's mainly just for England. By 2050, if we carry on using water the way we do at the moment, we don't do anything about it. It's the pressures that have come from our increasing population, our need to leave more water in the environment. By that, what we mean is actually leave more water in the chalk streams because we're taking too much out of them. And that's affecting the habitats of the wildlife that live there. And also climate change. You know, we've had this change in weather, we're getting changing weather patterns, and we need to have more reserves to be able to cope with that. So this is a map, the red one on the left there is a map of the temperature and how it's varied from the previous decade. So actually we've been between 0.5 and 1 degrees C higher on an average over last year compared to the previous decade. So we're definitely getting warmer. And if you look at the left-hand side, the orange and brown one, that's sunshine. And again, we've definitely got more sunshine. But if you look at the one in the middle, actually the change in the average rainfall isn't massively different. It's about sort of 85–95% of what we would normally expect as an average over the previous decade. But what's happened is that we get these longer dry spells and then we get sudden deluges of really heavy rain. So getting better at managing water has got to involve our soil. Just a little reminder, what causes floods and droughts? Well, actually, it's all related to rainfall. But floods happen when your soil moisture is really high, so you've got really wet soil. It tends to happen in the past, around February, when the winter rains have filled the soil up, it's saturated, there's just nowhere else for it to go. If you've got that long, prolonged rainfall, that's what's going to make it flood. If you've got lots of surface runoff, so if you've got compacted soil, if you've got lots of hard landscaping, you're going to have surface runoff, and that's going to create a flood. If your water holding capacity of the soil is low, so what we mean by that is how much can the soil actually hang on to. So clay can hold on to a lot of water, but it takes a long time to absorb that water in. So, you know, it's that combination of, is your soil compacted? What's the texture like as to whether the water can actually be held in the soil? And infiltration, by that what I mean is the ability of the rain to actually get through the surface of the soil and down into the root zone where it really needs to be. If you've got a soil cap, then that doesn't work so well. Droughts, you end up with droughts when you've got low soil moisture, end of August, you know, the plants have drawn the water out of the soil and you're really that low. We've got infrequent rain, we've got surface runoff, we've got water holding capacity in the soil, and we've got infiltration. Having just spoken about floods, you know, we have got some wildlife that are actually really good at flood engineering.
Yeah. So I've got here pictures of molehills, and besides a little dog who's 7 kilos, and the molehill is almost as wide as he is long, as you can see. The moles are about 100 grams in size, so, you know, tiny, 1/7 of what Patrick is on the screen there. Historically, they're thought of something as to be got rid of and moved on somehow. But actually, if you take this soil, it's great for putting seeds in. It's a lovely fine texture. They're just really good for the soil, and I don't think people realise how beneficial they can be, really, because they're bringing the air down to where it should be, the oxygen, and also helping drainage.
This infographic is on the RHS website, and there's a few interesting figures on there. You may not be able to read that really well, but it actually says that a layer of 75 millimetres of organic mulch can reduce evaporation by 27 litres per square metre per year. So in other words, if you put your compost or a mulch over the surface, you're cutting the surface evaporation of the moisture out of the soil, but you're also reducing the temperature as well. I'll show you a bit.
I just wanted to say that compost heaps, Jan, about them being an absolute hotspot for wildlife. So when you're using it at this time of year, probably just use gloves and, take off one layer at a time. You could easily disturb a bumblebee's nest or something like that. But other things you might find in your compost heaps, slow worms, love to bask on top of them because they're quite often really warm and they're nice if they're in a nice sunny spot.
And it's all food. It's, all those creatures are there. It's like the intensive restaurant in your compost heap, which then becomes a bit of a buffet when you put it out on the soil.
I mean, even if you've got rodents in your compost heap, they're still burrowing their way through a channel of your compost, and they will be doing work for you rather than turning it, disturbing it. They'll be making channels. Yeah, they will be. Anything.
So thinking about soil, if you've got clay soil, the particles are really tiny. The water can't really easily flow through it. You've got lots of tiny particles packed together very tightly. So actually, it's very different from having sandy soil and chalky soil, which tends to be happening around the Hampshire area. You've got very chalky soil down there. It's much more open and fissured, and the water can drain down much more easily. So if you get 100 millimetres of rain, then it's likely to reach to a different depth in your soil. And this is what helps to provide you with a more drought-resilient soil, is the fact that you've got rain that can go much deeper into the layers of the sandy or chalky soil because of those fissures. All you need to do then is actually find the right plants that have got equally as deep rooting systems to be able to find that moisture. And, we talk about water butts an awful lot, and water butts are fantastic. Everybody should have one or 3 or 11 like I've got. Actually, we sort of forget that nature's water butt is our soil, and we can store huge amounts of water in our soil if we just look after it really well. So just to put the numbers in perspective, a standard water butt is about 200 litres. An average garden is about 190 square metres. But if you've got an average garden with sandy soil, you've got a water holding capacity of about 271 water butts worth under your feet. So it's huge scope to actually keep the water in the soil if we can just keep it there. So how does the organic matter that we add to our soil actually hold on to water? There's several different things, and I'll talk in a bit more detail. Bacteria that we've already discussed a little bit, they're excreting material out, which is this gluey substance, which helps to stick then the crumbs of the soil together. But you've also got plants that will exude substances out of their roots in order to encourage certain bacteria to grow around their roots, which then provide them with nutrients. Root exudates can be things like sugars, carbohydrates, proteins, and organic acids. You've got mycorrhizal fungi, which can actually grow very close to the roots, but then extend a long way out from the root system and find more water and phosphorus. It helps to aerate the root zone. Because of this sticky substances, you get this crumb structure, which then opens the soil up and forms more aerated pockets. It insulates it from heat and cold. So if you're putting mulch over the top of your soil, then you've got an insulation layer which protects it from getting too hot and losing its moisture through the heat. And it improves the infiltration, so it lets the rain in. So if you've got loose organic matter on the top of the soil, it's going to drain really quickly through and it's going to end up in the root zone. Just talking a bit more about this sticky, gluey substance that we get. The exudates are actually come out of the plant roots, and they can be carbohydrates, organic acids, proteins. There is some research now that suggests that the plants are actually sending out the particular substances to encourage certain bacteria to grow. They're really good at providing the nutrients to plants. So it's a sort of a symbiotic relationship, really. But actually, these are very gluey, gel-like substances which then hold onto water, which works really well. If you think about, if you've ever seen the compost that comes out of a wormery, it's really sticky and gel-like and very wet. It's really very good at holding onto water. And the same thing happens, but on a microscopic level with bacteria. And it happens all the way up the food chain, really. I mean, anything, didn't want to really talk about too much about poo, but poo's really sticky and it holds onto moisture really well. And it's all those proteins and long chain chemicals that are forming those gel-like substances that holds it all together and creates that crumb structure that you see in a really good, healthy soil. And it's about getting that balance between water and air in your soil. So mycorrhizal fungi, this was a picture that I took from a pile of leaf mold that I had rotting away. If you see this in your compost heap, that's great. You know, it's not anything to be worried about. That's really what you want. This is the fungal mycelium. They extend through. They really like to feed on woody substances. So leaf mold and wood itself is really good for fungal growth. They like the carbon-based substances like wood, but they feed with much lower respiration. So it means that things don't need so much heat, and they don't actually need quite so much air either, which is why leaf mold containers don't really need to be turned. You can just keep them in a pile somewhere, and it will eventually rot away, no problem. Even the fruiting bodies, you can just nip them off and pop them back in the compost. And it shouldn't be a problem. But it's this mycelium that we really want to keep intact, because that's what's helping to draw water from much deeper and much wider areas within the soil. And that's why no dig works. If you're still digging your soil, every time you dig, you're breaking up these little mycelium and you're damaging the structure of the soil in that way. So when it comes to aerating the root zone, what's really important here is choosing the right plants for the type of soil that you've got. So if you've got really chalky, loose, sandy soil that drains really fast, it's not necessarily a problem for lots of watering. What you need to do is choose the right plants. So on the left here, we've got a Salvia nemorosa. This has been sold to me as a drought-tolerant plant, and I've put it in my garden and they die every time. And it took me a little while to realise it's because I've got really shallow soil. So it might be a drought-tolerant plant, but only if it can put its roots down. And actually there's a scale on the side there, and it goes down to a depth of 180 centimetres, nearly 2 metres. And you can understand then why that makes the plant drought tolerant. It's not that it's particularly using less water, it's just really good at finding the water that's there. If you're going to squash all those roots into a pot, then you've just got to keep watering it. But the key with that is as well, is it's that sandy, gravelly soil or chalky soil that's got those air spaces. So going back to the idea that, everything that's alive needs water and air. You can't have really wet, soggy soil. If you had a loam that was 1.8 meters deep, then it would be pretty much devoid of oxygen down at those depths. And so it wouldn't grow. So you need that chalky, sandy soil to be able to grow those sort of plants. And equally on the left here, we've got Allium porum, which is the good old leek. We know they like sort of damp, heavier soils. And when you look at the root structure, you can understand why, because that one's only going down to about 60 centimetres deep. Any deeper than that, there's unlikely to be that much oxygen available. But actually, because the soil is generally always damp, it can happily grow roots at the surface, and actually that's the place where it's going to get more air. So when you look at those root structures, it sort of makes sense what a healthy soil is for those plants. It's one that's got that balance of air and water in the right place where those roots are. Talking about insulating from heat and cold, roots are probably better off kept a little bit cooler than the surface. And that's because of this respiration. If you need oxygen, then keeping things cool means that oxygen will dissolve more in the water that's in your soil. And so keeping things cooler for roots is always a good idea. This was a little experiment I just did the other day. I just took my oven thermometer out in the garden. This is my lawn. We don't cut it particularly short because that just makes the surface dry out even more. But I'd also chucked a pile of weeds just on the top of the lawn. It really annoys my husband, but I just chucked them on the top of the lawn, left them there to dry out in the sun. And I thought, I just wonder how much temperature difference there is. So just put the probe into the grass itself at the soil surface. We got 26.2 degrees C. But underneath a layer of, and it wasn't a hugely thick layer, but just a layer of weeds that were drying out in the sun, and we've knocked it down by 5 degrees C. So that's going to reduce the surface evaporation, and it just proves that having that organic mulch over the surface of the soil is really great. If you run an allotment or anything like that, what I tend to do is I will pull out weeds, and if I've got bare soil, I'll just put them on the top of the bare soil because it just stops the evaporation from the surface. When it comes to adding mulch, what I tend to advise people these days is you hear people say that you shouldn't add mulch unless the soil's already wet. And it sort of makes sense because if you're putting mulch an extra layer on top and you only get light rainfall, then the water is not going to get through the mulch and it's just going to sit on the surface and evaporate. But if you use a very chunky mulch, so something that's going to drain really fast, the water should run through the mulch really quickly and get to the roots where it needs to be. So I don't recommend people use sort of like a multi-purpose compost as a mulch, unless you're doing something like vegetable growing where you really want a seed bed and you want the nutrients, then that's fine. But if you're doing it just to keep water in place, then the compost will just hold the water at the surface and increase your surface evaporation. And actually, these sort of leaf littery things, they're another great place for a habitat, aren't they? I mean, you might get slugs and snails, but brown beetles, they'll love that sort of stuff. So while we're making compost, one of the things I do hear a lot of people say is, oh, well, I just don't have room to deal with all my woody prunings. You know, there's just too much of it. It takes forever to rot down and I can't get rid of it. But this is great stuff for improving soil health. Wood fibre is the one thing that's one of the major ingredients that everybody's desperate for to make peat-free compost, because from next year we won't be able to buy any peat compost anymore, which is a great thing. But actually everybody's desperate for more wood fibre because it's really good at making compost. So finding ways to actually deal with it in your garden so that you can hang on to it, I think is a great thing. I had a huge buddleia that was not pruned the year before, so I really did need to bring it back to size a bit. Didn't want to get rid of all the wood and thought, well, what can I do with it? So I just stuck 4 pieces in the ground, fairly narrow pieces, like, you know, a sort of bamboo cane style, put them in the ground and then cut the rest up, drilled some holes in the bottom, and we've ended up with a nice little insect hotel. We've got one, and I looked today, there was another one that's moved in. It's only been up about a week. So I cut that back in February and I didn't actually get around to tidying it all up. But that can sit in the corner of your garden or at the back of the border and it will just slowly rot away and form places for spiders and woodlice. And the base of that insect hotel, I can guarantee it's going to be lovely and damp down there, even after 2 weeks of dry weather, because it's in contact with the soil. There is a little gap in underneath her as well. It's got that lovely, moist, damp place for lots of creatures to live in. You could also use it as a shade. You know, it shades the root zone of the plants that are around it. So it's acting as a mulch for those plants that are growing around it as well. I actually like my buddleia because it provides me with some lovely long canes that I use instead of bamboo for things like tomato growing. It's now providing me these little logs that are great. But like you say, you know, you just need to extend that and make it longer and make it into the dead hedge. Or this one on this side, I just pushed some sticks into the ground and then just wove it. You know, I just bunched up the sticks and then wove them between the sticks, cut it off to the level I wanted. But actually what it's doing for me, it's going to compost down and keep my soil healthy, but it's also providing a little bit of shade of the root zone. So the plants that are behind there are now slightly shaded on their roots. They can quite happily put their leaves up into the sun, but you've, again, lowered the temperature in the soil, which is great. And actually putting dead wood into the soil is also good. There's a lot of creatures that, I think it's brown beetles that like that as well, and they'll actually get into the dead wood in the ground, which is great. And I just trimmed it off with secateurs. If you spent the time doing it, you get it really tidy, but I just went over it afterwards and just trimmed all the bits off, and those bits went into the compost heap. Do try and think of ways of hanging on to the wood that you've got in your garden, because it's a really good resource for both wildlife and keeping soils healthy and watering the soil. Oxygen. I do refer to oxygen as the forgotten nutrient. So we talk about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, but actually, like I said, everything needs oxygen to be able to live. So even the roots of your plants, all the creatures in the soil, they all need oxygen. So getting air into the compost heap can be done by turning it. It can be done by adding things like unbroken eggshells. So lots of people break them up, but I leave them in their halves so that you've got a pocket of air. Toilet rolls do the same thing. I keep telling the kids not to squash the toilet roll middles because they'll go in the compost and keep a pocket of air. The woody prunings that I don't turn into other things, I do use them unshredded as a compost base, because you end up with a sort of aerated, tangled mess of prunings, which then allows the structure of the heap to stay without needing to turn it. So I had a back operation a few years back, and I just haven't got the energy or the muscle power anymore to go turning compost every couple of months. And this works really well for me. So having that structure of woody prunings means that it doesn't all collapse on itself and squash all the air out of it. I use chop and drop quite a bit as well. So if there's just a few weeds, rather than taking them constantly to the compost heap, chop the stem from the root so that there's less likelihood of it regrowing, drop it on the ground. And as I've done with the temperatures on my lawn, it just provides you with that constant feeding of organic material into the soil. You're feeding the creatures that live there. You're shading the soil, you're reducing the temperature, and you're stopping the evaporation. No dig is great. That really does make a difference on the amount of water that you need to add. And that surface mulch, it doesn't have to be really thick layers. It can be just enough to shade the soil and keep that surface layer really aerated. The other thing I do is I leave roots in the ground. So rather than digging old plants out, I'll just chop them off at ground level, leave the roots in, don't disturb it anymore. It's a no-dig technique, but actually, it means that those roots will just gradually go on and decompose themselves, forming that compost that you need. If it's salvia, you've managed to incorporate compost 180 centimetres deep into the ground. So that's great. I'll mention about construction waste. So this has got me thinking, actually, because we talk about organic material being the thing that we need to add to get healthy soil to be able to get drought-tolerant gardens. And that's true. But there's a lot of people that are now growing in construction waste. So crushed brick, broken gravel, broken concrete blocks and things. There's a lot of it at Chelsea this week that I've noticed there's people growing in piles of bricks and things. And you think, well, how does that work? And actually, when you think about it, it's back to this getting this balance of air and water. As long as you've got air and water in the right mix, the roots will grow. Obviously, if it's construction waste, it's a pile of bricks, you can't actually dig it anyway. So one of the best ways to deal with that is to just sprinkle seeds over the top. And there are a couple of people that do green roofs and things that are advocating this as a really good way of getting gardens going. It's really well drained because it's big inorganic lumps of rock or concrete. So again, the water goes deeply down in, the seeds can get their roots down in between these lovely aerated gaps. And that's the sort of the pioneer that starts putting the organic matter in to make soil. The plant root is actually the first of the organic matter that finds its way down into the soil, and you don't have to do any digging. So it does sort of work. One of the things that we did at the RHS when I was with them was we created this website. It's still active. Please do go and have a look. Mains to Rains was really to persuade people that you can still carry on gardening, you can still carry on watering your plants. But if we just switch to using rainwater instead of turning the tap on and using mains water, then everybody benefits. It means that you've probably got a water butt, which means that you're collecting water off the roof and reducing the flood risk in your area. It means that you're probably going to use less water because you'll use a watering can rather than a hose. and you'll direct the water at your roots rather than spraying it around everywhere. We need to remember that the mains water is coming out of wonderful habitats like the chalk streams. And so we're trying to generate a beautiful garden for ourselves. In the meantime, we're actually helping to destroy a beautiful habitat, which is a chalk stream. So actually collecting rainwater is then benefiting everybody because we are reducing a flood risk and we are helping to maintain our soils, and we're doing all those other cultivation techniques like choosing the right plants, getting the right plants for the right sort of soil texture that you've got, using organic mulch, and all of those things actually help to keep the soil healthy, keep all the wildlife happy. There is really no downside. Do please go and have a look. It's called Mains to Rains, and it will also give you an indication of how much water you potentially could save, how much water you potentially save and leave in a chalk stream to go on and look after the habitat that's there.
So yeah, I constructed this little chart of what we think it does versus what things actually do. So I started with earthworms, obviously. I think we kind of take them for granted a little bit. You know, if you dig in the soil, you'll find one, which is more or less true. Nobody's particularly that grossed out by earthworms. They tend not to come at you, like they can't fly, obviously. So, but actually, they have a massive job in our soil health, and they put holes in our soil. They burrow down really deeply, or certain species do anyway, of earthworms. And then they exchange the air. When they come up to the surface, they exchange the stale air for oxygen, and they swap it. So they're taking oxygen back down with them when they go back down the tunnels. Yeah, 30 different types in the UK that we've got. There is one type that actually only lives in the leaf litter. It doesn't really burrow at all. The main burrower, he can live for 8 years, that type of earthworm. But yeah, I mean, number one, we've really got to look after them, and they are in decline, which is terrifying, really. It's something you really think is always going to be there. Next is earwigs. They are becoming heroic, I would say, lately. You know, the aphid population, they can really decimate quite easily. So people now are putting little traps in to trap earwigs, and then they're moving the traps with the earwigs in it alive and putting them on their beans or whatever, so they can be put in the right place and help, rather than people having to use sprays and pesticides perhaps to get rid of the aphids, which I'm sure probably the aphids come out at this time of year to help the baby birds. And, you know, it's a huge amount of foods that the parent birds can quickly go and get, things like blue tits, great tits. You know, you could also encourage them to breed in your garden or very nearby, so that you could keep the amount down. And, you know, things balance out eventually. But obviously we have got this perception that they eat dahlias and crawl into people's ears if they could possibly get in there, you know. And then there's snails. Yeah, they do eat our plants sometimes, our favourite plants, and they can be such a pain in the bum, I'm sure. But, you know, there's two sides to every story, I like to think. So small birds don't have enough calcium within their own bones to give any out when they lay eggs. So things like robins and great tits, again, they have to get some calcium from somewhere, and they choose to eat eggshells quite often. Some of them actually eat woodlice to boost themselves up before they can lay eggs. And there's some species of solitary bees who only choose to lay their little nests in snail shells, and they then take a lot of bother to sort of cover them over so they're not seen anymore and hidden a little bit while the babies will hatch out the next springtime. If we use things like slug pellets, it's not just the slugs and snails that will die from that. It is everything else that eats it as well. They don't necessarily die from it when you get song thrushes or hedgehogs eating, unless they eat a really large amount. But I mean, they're not going to function very well. And wildlife is always on a knife edge of how to cope. How can it cope with being out in the wild? It has to perform really well. It has to be near enough 100% in order to function, be successful, really. So you have to think about putting these poisons down in our garden. And then there's ants. People really don't like ants, and it's such a shame because I don't particularly know why.
Just because they crawl.
I think so. And there's a lot of them. I think it probably stems from when you do get ants in your house, which I can imagine is not, it's not very pleasant really. But when they're out in the garden in the right place, they're like mini moles really, because they can help aerate the soil as well. They have this symbiosis with blue butterflies, not all blue butterflies, but some of them, when they have the larval stage, they're reared by ants. And then onto caterpillars in general. We don't always identify what the caterpillars are. They can be baby butterflies and moths. Sometimes, sawflies and things like that can look very similar. Yeah. They are baby butterflies and moths. And if you want more in your garden, then this is where they come from. And some moths have got brilliant names, like peach blossom. There's one called a spectacle. And when you look straight on at the spectacle's face, and they actually have spectacles on their head. They're just bizarre and wonderful. Then there's a Chinese character which looks like a tiny little bird poo. That's one of my favourites ever. And then on to woodlice. Cute and benign. Yeah, they kind of are. And they make compost for us. So that's a really good thing to keep in your garden as well.
That's really great. And I think, woodlice actually are crustaceans, and they need that damp, cool area because they don't breathe. They've got gills, haven't they?
Yeah.
So they need that dampness. I just looking at this list and thinking, oh my goodness, this is where we get all our natural swell gel from, really. I mean, all of these creatures will be providing excrement, which is then providing that sort of natural swell gel, which gives you that water holding capacity in your soil. And it's a bit like a list of nutrients on legs. All of these things will move, and they're bringing those nutrients into your garden. They're all really good for soil health in their own way. I know snails eat our plants, but actually there's a lot of slugs that only eat dead material, constantly making you compost for better soil health again. So, it's all just that cycle of moving nutrients around your garden, making the plant material then returned back into the soil so that the nutrients can be available to the plants again. We've got this circular system going on all the time, which is it's what helps keep the water in place. And here's a nice little reminder of what we're talking about. When we think about the mains water that's coming through our tap, we need to remember a lot of it does come from chalk streams. They're beautiful habitats. I would love to have that at the bottom of my garden. That would be fantastic. I'd be more than happy with that. So it's just that reminder that, while we're trying to create wonderful gardens for ourselves, we might be using mains water, which is coming from a very beautiful habitat like this. This is photo credit to Mike Blackmore, who's very kindly let me have some of his lovely chalk streams. He works a lot on restoring these sort of chalk streams, putting gravel back in, whereas in the 1970s we tended to try to dredge them all out so that we thought we were helping with flooding, and actually we realised that that's not the way to go. I mean, he actually spends a lot of time putting gravel back into beautiful chalk streams like this. One of the things about chalk streams is the water tends to come up through the gravels direct from the aquifer. And so it's usually pretty cold. So on a really hot summer day, the water is still quite cold. And a lot of the work that he also does on the banks of the streams is to make sure that those trees are in place, because the overhanging trees provide the shade from the sun, and that helps to stop excessive growth of algae. It helps to keep the temperature of the water down. And we can do the same sort of things in our gardens. I cut my budget down, and now I was fretting, thinking, I've let a load more light in, I've let a load more sun in, it's going to be so much warmer, which is why I then put the little dead hedge the other side, thinking at least I can put some of it back in as shade for the roots. So just watching nature can give you ideas of how nature copes with the extremes and the climate changes that we're going to face in the future, and just mimicking them in the garden rather than assuming that nature can keep providing for us by providing mains water. Yeah, there's another one. Beautiful. Nettles. ranunculus, that big green swathe in the middle is the ranunculus, which is it's beginning to get into flower now. You get a lovely little white flower with a yellow middle. You get swathes of that through a chalk stream. It's actually beautiful and very cooling, very soothing.
Lovely.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. That's our contact details. If there's any more questions that you've got, then Vickie has a Facebook page called Be Wild.
Yep.
She posts all sorts of lovely things on there. Is your Swift on there?
My Swift encounter of the week is on there.
That's
yes.
wonderful. Yeah, and I tend to use Twitter rather than Facebook. So yeah, by all means, keep in touch.